If your baby started crying before you reach this river, you turn back immediately. Not because the bridge was broken, and not because the water was deep, but because everyone knew once the river had a crying child, it would ask for one. Before we continue, please tell me where you are watching from in the comment section. I might just send you a virtual hug in my next one. Now, everything I'm about to tell you was told to me by my grandmother. She never called it a legend. She called it a memory because according to her, she was there before that river ever existed. So, sit back, dim the light, and let me tell you why my grandmother never crossed a strange river without first listening. My grandmother said when she was a little girl, there was no river there, only a long dusty road where traders, farmers, hunters, and even travelers passed every single day. It was more than a road. It was the only road connecting several towns. If you wanted to trade, visit family, or travel to the next village, you passed through that junction. And everyone knew one woman in that place. Not because she was wealthy, not because she was the chief's daughter, not even because she held any title, but because she had the kindest heart anyone had ever known. If a traveler arrived hungry, she fed them. If a widow had nothing to cook, somehow she found food to share. If a child cried from hunger, she treated that child as though it were her own. My grandmother used to smile whenever she spoke about her. She always said, some people become rich, others become respected, but very few become loved. And this woman was loved by everyone. Or at least, that's what she believed. Because every evening, after helping everyone else, she would return home, closed her door, kneel beside her bed, and whisper the same prayer every single night. God, before I leave this world, please let me know what it feels like to hear one child call me mother. But year after year, the only thing that answered was silence. She never stopped praying. She never stopped hoping. She never stopped helping people. She had no idea that the same people whose life she was busy holding together would one day be the reason her own life falls apart. Years passed, and the prayer remained the same. But one afternoon, everything changed. Her husband bowed to pressure, not from stranger, but from his own family. They told him, a man deserved children, a family deserved an heir, a home deserved laughter. And if one woman could not give him that, another would. So, he married again. My grandmother used to say, the first wife never fought him. She never shouted. She never even cursed him. Instead, she welcomed the new wife. With food she cooked herself, she smiled, even when her own heart was breaking, because she believed kindness could heal what sorrow could not. Then, the second wife became pregnant. The whole compound rejoiced. Drums were played, songs were sung, prayers were answered. And the first wife danced with everyone else. She carried gifts, cooked for visitors, blessed the unborn child, as though it were her very own. My grandmother said that was the day she realized goodness and happiness are not always the same, because while everyone celebrated, nobody noticed the woman who smiled the brightest, cried the hardest when she was finally alone. The baby was born. Then another, and another, and another season of joy came to that house. But somewhere between the lullabies and the laughter, something else quietly found its way in. Not love, not peace, envy. And envy never enters a home quietly for long. Everything seemed peaceful. The two women lived under the same roof. They cooked together, fetched water together, welcomed visitors together. And whenever people praised the kindness of the first wife, The second wife smiled, but my grandmother used to say, not every smile is a kind one. Then the children came. The first one, the whole village celebrated. The second one, the compound rejoiced again. By the third, everyone had stopped asking whether the first wife would ever become a mother. They already had their answer. At first, the second wife didn't insult her. She didn't need to. She simply enjoyed reminding everyone that her own children were living proof of what the first wife could never have. My son is hungry. My daughter is sleeping. My children this, my children that. My children, my children, my children. Words that were innocent to everyone else became knives to the woman who had prayed for just one child to call her mother. Then the whispers began. One neighbor said, maybe God has forgotten her. Another laughed. What's the use of a woman who cannot bear a child? At the market, people stopped lowering their voice when she walked past. They wanted her to hear. And she did. Every word, every laugh, every silence that followed. But the cruelest part wasn't what strangers said. It was who said it. The very women whose children had eaten from her pot. The very family she had helped when they had nothing. The very neighbors who once called her a blessing. Now they call her barren. Empty. Useless. My grandmother said the insults were no longer spoken in anger. They became a song. Children repeated it. Adults laughed at it. Visitors joined in. Until nobody remembered when it had first begun. Cruelty has become a tradition. And the most dangerous thing about cruelty is how quickly people forget they are being cruel. My grandmother used to say, there is only so much a human heart can carry. Not because it is weak, but because even the strongest roof eventually collapses if the rain never stops. The woman never stopped helping. Every morning, she still swept the compound. She still cooked for visitors. She still shared food with hungry children. She still smiled, even at the people who had forgotten how much of their life she had once carried. Kindness was no longer something she did. It was simply who she was. Then, one evening, the entire compound gathered outside. Children were playing. Women were talking. Men had returned from the farm. It felt like every other evening until the second wife spoke. My grandmother never repeated what she said. She always told me some words should die with the people who spoke them. But she did tell me what happened next. The compound became quiet for just a moment. Then, someone laughed. Another joined. Then another. And then another. Until the whole compound was laughing at her. She didn't cry. She didn't defend herself. She didn't ask anyone why. She simply looked around at every faces she had once called family, at every neighbor she had once fed, at every child she had once carried on her own back. And for the first time in many years, she understood something. She had been giving her heart to people who had never intended to protect it. Without saying a single word, she stood up, straightened her wrapper, wiped her face, and began to walk. Past the children she had fed, past the neighbors she had helped, past the homes where she had once been welcomed with smile. Nobody stopped her. Nobody called her back. Nobody asked where she was going. They were too busy laughing to notice. They had just watched the kindest woman in their village walk out of it forever. Sometimes, the loudest cry a person will ever cry is the one they make without saying a single word. My grandmother said she watched that woman until she disappeared beyond the last house and the village. She never looked back. Not once. She walked past the market where traders she had once helped sold their goods. She walked past the old baobab tree where children used to gather around her for story. She walked past the farms where family whose life she had touched carried on as though nothing had happened. And then she reached the crossroad, the place where every road from the surrounding town became one. If you were traveling, you passed there. If you were returning home, you passed there. It was impossible to avoid. My grandmother never claimed to know what happened next. She only said, from a distance, she saw the woman standing alone, not crying, not screaming, just standing, as though she was speaking to someone no one else could see, or perhaps to something. The wind suddenly changed. Birds that had been singing stopped. Even the trees became strangely still. My grandmother said she had never seen silence behave that way before. Fear found her and she ran home. Nobody saw the woman again. But at sunrise, the villagers woke up to something that had never existed the day before. A river, flowing through the very place where the woman had last been seen. And from that morning, nothing was ever the same again. At first, the villagers celebrated. A river where no river had ever existed. Fresh water, rich soil, a blessing. Or so they believed. Women crossed it every morning. On their way to the market, farmers crossed it, carrying their harvest. Children splashed along its bank. Life simply continued. Until one morning, everything changed. A young mother was crossing the road. A baby was tied securely to her back. Halfway across, the baby began to cry. Not from pain, not from sickness, just crying. The kind of cry every mother knows. The kind that says, "Hold me." My grandmother said the woman kept walking. She never stopped to comfort the child. Then, the river moved. Not violently, not like a flood. It rose, gently, almost lovingly, as though invisible arms were reaching for a child. The woman screamed. She tried to run, but before she could turn around, the baby was gone. The water became calm again, as though nothing had happened. The entire village searched for days. They searched upstream, downstream, through the forest. They found nothing. Then, another child. Weeks later, another. Always the same. A crying baby. A gentle river. Then, silence. Until one elder remembered the woman who had prayed all her life just to hear one child cry in her own arms. And in that moment, the whole village finally understood. The river was never taking children out of anger. It was taking the only thing life had spent years denying her. Sometimes, the deepest wounds do not disappear. They simply find another way to be heard. Fear spread faster than the river itself. Mothers stopped crossing alone. Fathers carried their children instead. Some families chose to walk for hours just to avoid that river. But no matter how many stories people told, the river never changed. So the elders gathered. The oldest men, the oldest women, priests, custodians of the old ways. They stood at the river's edge, searching for an answer. Then, one old woman spoke. This river did not begin as water. She remembered the woman who never ate until everyone else had eaten. She remembered the woman who fed children that were never hers. She remembered the woman who walked away while everyone laughed. And one by one, the others remembered too. Suddenly, the river was no longer a mystery. It had a face, a voice, a broken heart. They realized they were not standing before a curse. They were standing before the grief they had created. My grandmother said, something changed in the faces of those elders. For the first time, they were no longer afraid of losing children. They were ashamed of remembering too late. They brought offerings, kola nuts, palm oil, white clothes. They stood before the river and apologized, not with pride, not with excuses, but with tears. They called her name. They confessed what they had done. They admitted they had failed the kindest woman they had ever known. The river listened, but it did not answer. The water only rose higher, as though even the apology had arrived too late. Some apologies are meant to heal, others arrive only to prove how long someone suffered before anyone finally noticed. The elders understood. There was only one thing left to do. If grief refused to leave, then it would have to be moved. My grandmother said people came from neighboring towns, not to watch, to pray. The oldest priests arrived. The oldest women came. Men who carried the ancient knowledge stood together at the river edge. Nobody spoke loudly. Even the children seemed to understand that this was not a battle. It was a farewell. Then the prayers began. Words my grandmother said she never heard again for the rest of her life. The wind rose. The tree bent. The sky grew darker. And then the river moved. Not like water, like something slowly standing up after carrying unbearable pain for far too long. The earth trembled. Trees fell. Small footpaths disappeared beneath the rushing water. But my grandmother said none of that was what she remembered most. What she remembered was the crying. A cry so deep, it didn't sound like one woman anymore. It sounded like every tear she had swallowed while people laughed, every prayer that had gone unanswered, every insult she had forgiven, every lonely night she had survived alone. My grandmother said that cry traveled farther than the river itself. Villages that had never met her had her that day. Hunters deep inside the forest had it. Mothers held their children tighter because they had it. Even the animals fell silent, as though the whole earth had stopped to mourn one woman. And before the sunrise, the river was gone. Nobody knows where it went. Some say it found another place to rest. Others believe it is still wandering, searching for a home where kindness is never mistaken for weakness. My wonderful viewers, my grandmother never told me this story to make me afraid of rivers. She told me to make me afraid of becoming the kind of person who notices someone's worth only after they are gone. Because the truth is, not everyone becomes a river, but everyone leaves something behind. A memory, a scar, a silence, or even a lesson. So, be careful how you treat people while they still have a face to smile at you. Don't wait until all that is left is an apology with no one left to hear it. Because some wounds never stop hurting. They simply change shape. And sometimes they become the very thing the whole world learns to fear. My wonderful viewers, if this story stayed with you, then don't let it end here. Join our little family by subscribing to After Dark Tale by Bon. Every week, we will journey into stories that don't just scare you, they stay with you. Until our next tale, be kind because you never truly know what someone is carrying. Good night.